The men who climbed into a B-17 flying fortress at the height of the air war over Europe understood the odds better than anyone. They had seen what happened to bombers that didn't make it back: charred husks scattered across fields in Belgium, silent craters in Germany, trails of smoke folding downward into the Channel. And yet, morning after morning, they boarded the same aircraft with a quiet confidence. The fortress was more than a machine to them. It was a lifeline, a shell of aluminum and steel that seemed to carry a will of its own. Even before the most famous story circulated, ground crews had begun whispering about the things they were seeing. A fortress returning with a hole the size of a door blown through the fuselage. Another limping home with its radio room shredded, the gunner crouched behind a single sheet of torn metal. Mechanics inspected these wrecks the way a doctor inspects a patient who has somehow survived a fall from a cliff. No matter how many times they saw it, the shock never wore off. One of the first truly bewildering moments came after a raid over Bremen. A 20mm cannon shell struck the left wing root of a B-17 with such violence that pilots in nearby aircraft saw debris scatter like confetti. The crew inside felt the aircraft buckle, as though the wing were trying to tear itself away. But instead of breaking, the airframe held. The pilot fought the controls as the bomber slipped out of formation, bleeding altitude, the damaged wing groaning under stress. Over the North Sea, where so many wounded aircraft had vanished into the cold water, the fortress somehow stayed aloft. When it finally touched down on an English airfield, the left side of the aircraft looked as if it had been chewed open by a giant. No one could understand how it had flown. By late 1943, the Germans had mastered the art of flak concentration. Batteries along the Ruhr and central Germany created walls of black shrapnel dense enough to rip a formation apart in seconds. Crews described the sound of fragments shredding through the fuselage, sharp metallic slashes that echoed inside their helmets. Pilots watched fuel spray from ruptured lines, control cables snap, engines cough flame. But even then, the B-17 often refused to give up. A bomber could lose an engine, then another, and still maintain a slow, stubborn climb. It was not uncommon for a fortress to return with its bomb bay doors jammed open, its hydraulics severed, and its electrical systems fried, yet still remain controllable. What left the deepest impression were the moments when the B-17 seemed to cross the line between engineering and miracle. On one mission, a shell exploded beneath the tail of a fortress, tearing open part of the rear fuselage and slamming the tail gunner against the bulkhead. The gun mount was destroyed, the floor partially collapsed, and cold air blasted through a jagged wound in the structure. The bomber's stability should have been ruined. Instead, the pilot found that the aircraft, damaged, shaking, barely holding together, still responded to his touch. The crew bandaged their wounds, braced against the icy draft, and prayed the tail wouldn't shear off before they reached the coast. Rumors began spreading across airfields. A B-17 had come back with half its vertical fin missing, another with its cockpit windows completely blown out, another with a gaping wound in the wing that would have destroyed any other bomber in the air. These weren't exaggerations told over whiskey. They were documented, photographed, studied by officers who were beginning to realize that the B-17's toughness was becoming a weapon in itself. A machine that could survive the impossible didn't just save crews, it kept the entire bombing campaign alive. And yet, as incredible as these early stories were, the most unbelievable survival tales were still ahead. Incidents so extreme that historians would later struggle to explain how these aircraft stayed in the sky at all. The winter of 1943 marked the point when the air war reached its most brutal rhythm. Crews were flying deeper, the Luftwaffe remained deadly, and the flak grew thicker with every mile. Yet it was during these darkest months that the B-17's most extraordinary stories began to emerge, reports so unbelievable that even combat-hardened officers questioned whether physics could bend that far. One fortress, returning from a mission over central Germany, was hit by a burst of flak that tore away most of its left horizontal stabilizer. In any normal aircraft, losing that much of the tail would mean instant death. The bomber should have flipped into an uncontrollable spin, scattering its crew across farmland below. Instead, the pilot felt the aircraft shudder violently, then slowly settle into something resembling level flight. He used asymmetric engine power to steer, nudging the throttles with the delicacy of a surgeon. The crew huddled together, waiting for the structural failure that never came. They crossed the channel, losing altitude the entire way, and crash-landed in England with a tail so mangled that senior officers initially believed the damage had occurred on the ground. Only after interviewing the crew did they accept the truth. The B-17 had flown hundreds of miles without the aerodynamic surfaces that made flight possible. But even that was not the most astonishing survival that winter. During a raid on Schweinfurt, a city already infamous among bomber crews, a B-17 took a direct cannon hit to the nose. The blast tore open the front of the aircraft, shredding the bombardier's compartment and leaving a gaping hole where the clear plexiglass cone used to be. At 20,000 feet, freezing wind roared through the cockpit like a living thing. The bombardier and navigator were suddenly exposed to open sky, their oxygen masks frosting white, their gloves stiffening with ice. With instruments fogging and the slipstream battering their faces, they fought simply to breathe, and yet the mission continued. The pilot kept formation long enough to release the bomb load over the target, refusing to break away until the job was done. The crippled fortress fell behind soon afterward, limping westward alone as German fighters closed in. But the Luftwaffe made a mistake. They assumed the bomber was finished. They attacked without the caution normally used against a full-strength B-17, and several gunners, still functional despite the devastation around them, returned fire with ferocity. The fighters broke off. Hours later, the bomber, later nicknamed the Flying Cigar, landed in England with half its nose missing, its crew nearly frozen solid, but alive. Still, nothing captured the essence of the B-17's reputation like the case of the bomber that returned with a wing that by all rights should not have existed. On a mission into Germany, the aircraft flew through a dense curtain of flak. One shell detonated beneath the starboard wing, ripping away several feet of the outer section. Pilots in the formation watched in horror as the metal sheared off, spiraling downward until it vanished in the clouds below. The wounded fortress rolled hard to the right, losing altitude in a sickening dive. The crew braced for the impact they were certain would come. But the pilot fought, pushing the remaining engines to their limits. Slowly, impossibly, the aircraft leveled out. The right wing was twisted like a broken arm, its internal spars exposed, control surfaces shredded, and yet it generated just enough lift to keep the bomber flying. Every mile back toward England was a battle. The crew watched the wing flex and groan, convinced it would snap with the slightest turbulence. Fuel leaked in a shimmering trail behind them. The engines coughed, wheezed, and sputtered, but mile by mile the coast drew closer. When the bomber finally reached an emergency strip in East Anglia, the pilot lowered the gear, only for one wheel to collapse moments after touchdown. The aircraft skidded across the field in a shower of dirt and torn metal. Fire crews raced forward expecting the worst. Instead, the crew climbed out shaking, exhausted but very much alive. Officers later measured the missing section of wing and concluded that the aircraft should have fallen apart in mid-air, and yet it hadn't. It had refused. Stories like these began circulating far beyond the bases in England. They appeared in newspapers, in recruiting films, even in informal lectures delivered to new bomber crews. The B-17 wasn't just an airplane, it had become a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of a kind of mechanical loyalty that war rarely grants. For the men who flew her, this mattered. When you sat in a freezing cockpit, staring at black explosions rising toward you, knowing that a single shell might end your life, belief was as important as armor. And the B-17 gave them that belief. The Flying Fortress was never the fastest bomber, nor the most advanced, nor even the one that dropped the most tonnage. But it earned something far greater, the trust of the men whose fate depended on its strength. Thousands survived the war because their aircraft absorbed damage no machine should endure. Long after the conflict ended, veterans struggled to explain it in technical terms. Many concluded the same way. The B-17 simply wanted to bring its crew home. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate you being here. If you enjoyed the video, a like and a subscription go a long way and help me keep making these World War II stories.